The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Rogers M. Smith on returning populism to its progressive roots, Sabeel Rahman on realizing an inclusive and responsive democracy for the future, plus Bill Press with Brian Stelter on the toxic political mix of Donald Trump and Fox News. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Sabeel Rahman is a leading scholar of democracy, law, and inequality. In his newest book, co-authored with Hollie Russon Gilman, he calls for a transformative model for democracy reform that fundamentally redistributes power to citizens. And it couldn't come at a more critical time. And we say hello to Sabeel Rahman, an associate professor of law at Brooklyn Law School and president of Demos. He's also the co-author, most recently, of Civic Power, Rebuilding American Democracy in an Era of Crisis. Sabeel Rahman, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you with us. So I guess about a year ago, you co-authored the book that I just mentioned, along with Hollie Russon Gilman, titled Civic Power, Rebuilding American Democracy in an Era of Crisis. I imagine you had not envisioned the kind of crisis we are in now. What was the crisis you were referring to at the time?
Yeah, I mean, it's the world is moving so fast. In 2020 time, every week is like a year when you think of just the layer of crisis upon crisis, from the pandemic to the uprisings for racial justice to just the active rigging of our election, dismantling of our election infrastructure before our eyes. We can't say that we anticipated any of those things, but I do think the underlying crisis, the underlying structures that are disrupting our democracy have been there all along, even before the events of 2020. And so what Hollie and I, my co-author in the book, what we really wanted to do is to take the conversation about, Trump is breaking all these norms about how government normally operates, and we need to get back to sort of how things were before. The argument we really wanted to make is that democracy was already failing, even in the good old days of 2010, even in the good old days of 2008, even in the good old days of the 90s, that the deeper structural problems of our democracy are really about power, that we have a political system and an economic system that concentrates control over political and economic decision makings at the very top. And until we do something fundamental about that disparity of power, we're going to be just trimming around the edges of what is a deeper crisis. And so that's where we really wanted to focus the book. And I think in a lot of ways, the events of 2020 are just accentuating that we got to deal with those deeper structural questions of power if we want to get out of this.
Yeah, so let's talk about these fundamentally deep problems of the way power is distributed that you write about. Give us an overall sense of what you mean by that critique.
Yeah, so I think for a lot of folks, especially when you're looking in the democracy reform sort of civic engagement world, people say, oh, well, we want to increase the opportunities for citizens to participate. Let's have more town halls, more input into governmental decision making. That's all fine and good, but what we're really worried about is who is actually the decision maker. And let's actually kind of broaden our scope outside of elections. Elections are really important. We have to defend fair and equal access to the ballot, and that's certainly under threat. We don't want to minimize that. But we also want to highlight that even after the election, a lot of policy happens not in the ballot box, not even in the legislature, but in other places where government makes decisions. Think about the zoning board that is deciding, how our cities are going to be built, which then has these huge implications for economic justice, for racial justice. Even now with the pandemic, right? You see the way that our cities concentrate pollution and then are concentrating risk factors in Black and brown communities. Those are decisions not made in the elections, but made by government bodies, zoning bodies, administrative bodies. And if you think about the COVID response, the federal government spent trillions. A lot of it didn't make its way into actual communities and actual families on the ground. Those are also decisions made by the Treasury Department, made by the Federal Reserve. So we have a lot of institutions that have power that most voters and most sort of town hall participants are not actually able to influence. And so when we're talking about changing power, democratizing power, we're really trying to think through in the book, what would it look like if we actually remade all those government bodies so that they were more inclusive, more representative, and more responsive to ordinary folks?
So when I vote for person A, because I like person A's stance on many different things, socioeconomic, whatever it is, person A then turns around and appoints different people for all these different positions. I have no say over that. And that's going to lead to the ineffective governing, the ineffective policy making that you're talking about.
That's a great example. So, it makes a difference that, say, Trump appoints the head of the Department of Labor, someone who's pretty, not at all interested in protecting workers. The appointments part is part of it. That's also true at the state and local level, right? We vote for mayor, we vote for city councilors, but we also have a lot of state and local bodies that have huge decision-making power. The Flint water crisis is in part was a crisis about insufficient accountability about the water utility, which was staffed by folks appointed by the governor. And so this is a problem at every level of government about who's actually making decisions. The other thing that I want to also mention is that we also oftentimes aren't even aware of what the issues are that are being debated under the table. Right? Like there's only so many issues that make their way onto the headlines that, we're paying attention to when we're campaigning around an election season. But a lot of stuff is just happening behind the scenes, which we don't know about it. We don't hear about it as the public. And that's also part of the problem.
Now, you also describe many democracy reform efforts as not going far enough. What are they missing? Give us some examples of that.
So I think the biggest thing that often is missing is this attention to the realities of decision-making power. So a lot of the familiar things folks will have heard of. Oh, we should make government more transparent. We should make government more rational and fact-based and more efficient at making its decisions and implementing its policies. Those are all good ideas. They're not, I don't disagree with them in the abstract. But they're not actually really about changing power. They're not about ensuring accountability, that government actually responds to ordinary folks, especially to working folks, to Black and brown folks. Government could release all the documents it wants, and if we still don't have a way of forcing policymakers to pay attention to what's happening on the ground, right? Transparency is better than not, but it's not going to get us all the way there. So I think there's that's the bubble we wanted to burst, that there's sort of like easy reforms that are, good in their own right, but they're not up to the task, up to the scale of the type of problem that we're in.
We're speaking with Sabeel Rahman, an associate professor of law at Brooklyn Law School, president of Demos, and also co-author, along with Hollie Russon Gilman, of Civic Power, Rebuilding American Democracy in an Era of Crisis. Sabeel, the book advocates for new civic institutions that are expressly engaged in increasing the power of previously disempowered groups, and you cite examples. Where are you seeing this work?
Yeah, so this is actually an area where I'm an optimist by heart, and there's a lot of incredibly important work being done on the ground by social movements, grassroots organizers, policy innovators at the state and local level. I'll say as a sidebar for folks who don't know Demos, Demos's work, we're a think tank that works with grassroots social movements to advance these types of structural power shifting reforms in our economy and in our democracy. And I mention that because I think in this purge, I've gotten to see and work with a lot of really great folks. So some of the examples that we mentioned in the book, we give the example of a lot of the new types of worker organizing that is happening around the country. And this was even pre-COVID. It's accelerated during COVID. If you think about all the labor strikes happening among, say, Amazon warehouse workers, new forms of organizing among the essential workers in this economy who are demanding, hazard pay, protective equipment, but also really trying to make the case that workers should have a bigger share of decision-making power over company policies and over the economy. That's the kind of civic power that we're talking about. To give another example, sticking to the city level, a lot of grassroots groups in the urban justice world, we profile in the book, for example, the Partnership for Working Families. There are a lot of groups that are doing work around issues like affordable housing. And the demands there are not just about we need more investment in affordable housing. It's also trying to push for the idea that residents, community members should have more of a say in setting those zoning policies in the first place. And so that's something, in New York, where we're based, we do a lot of work with Community Voices Heard, another grassroots partner that's been advancing affordable housing and racial justice in New York. And so what I like about these examples is they show that real power, the kind of power that we're talking about in the book, requires a combination of new policies that can create more leverage for folks on the ground and civil society organizing. You need those grassroots community groups to be knocking on doors, to be organizing community members. And if you put those two together, now you're in business.
Well, now, as more people gain power, some people lose their share of power. As you've looked at efforts to build this kind of civic power, have they been met with resistance?
Yeah, absolutely. And in a lot of ways, the story of our democracy, of American democracy, is a story of this like constant push-pull, right? You see advances for democratizing decision-making and then a backlash against it. If you go back, a lot of folks are still mourning the passing of John Lewis a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things, real undertold stories about the civil rights movement was how we know about some of the national stuff, Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, but a big part of the civil rights movement was also trying to wrest control over decision-making and put it in the hands of Black and brown communities at the local level. So you saw a lot of battles over zoning policies, over social safety net policies at the state and local level around Johnson's war on poverty in the 60s. That was met by backlash from including a lot of Democratic mayors, big D Democratic mayors, who didn't like that threat to their power and clawed it back, tried to really crack down on these community groups. You're seeing a lot of the same back and forth play out right now. If you think about the demands coming from the Movement for Black Lives or from worker organizers, the Red for Ed teacher strikes, like you're seeing attempts by ordinary folks to demand more say. And you're seeing a backlash in a lot of cases, a violent backlash from police, from the state. The Portland violence in Portland that we're seeing right now, I read that as exactly this, right? You have an uprising, grassroots uprising, demanding a radical change to our systems of collective safety and criminal law, and you're seeing a crackdown on those demands. So that resistance you named, Jim, is sort of central to everything I think we're seeing happening right now.
Yeah. And then there's another form of resistance. It's that, quote, "this is the way we've always done it," close quote.
Totally.
What's your sense that communities are ready to take on the hard work of rebuilding the structures of their civic institutions?
Totally. So I think that I love this question because this idea that, well, it's always been a certain way, it's always been done a certain way, that's often it's like a softer form of resistance, but it is still resistance to this idea of democracy. And in a lot of ways, I would argue that the community groups, grassroots communities, they are and have always been the experts in what is going on in their communities and what the solutions are. Because who knows it better than the people who are living it day in and day out? The folks who are not prepared, who are not ready for this kind of democracy, tend to be this sort of old guard, right? Like we've always done it a certain way. It's so easy to say, well, people, if you throw it up into the people, look at all the bad decisions that might happen. Well, I'd say look at all the terrible decisions that happen with our current system, right? You got to compare apples to apples. That's not a good argument to my mind about why we shouldn't do more to democratize our decision making.
Sabeel, in this moment of crisis, what's at stake if we fail to build into our recovery the kind of civic power that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think the stakes couldn't be higher at this moment, and folks don't need me to remind them what's happening all around us, right? We're seeing this pandemic is raging across the country. We're now at 30, 40%, 30, 40 million people unemployed, worst job numbers in our history. And people are still dying from a healthcare crisis, a pandemic crisis that is really a failure of government, a failure of democratic accountability or lack thereof when you look at the federal government's response. So the stakes are literally life and death, right? We have a government that is not interested in protecting the health and safety of its people. And that is not a democracy. I would argue we no longer live in a democracy and haven't for a while. Building in these types of power shifting strategies into our recovery, I think, is essential, both for saving people's lives in the short term and for ensuring that government actually protects us and responds to our needs in the long term.
Do you feel in this moment of such urgency and recognition of how government can fail us, as you've just pointed out, that there will be a broader opening to the ideas that you're talking about?
I think you're seeing that opening. I'm optimistic about what could come out of this moment. I think it's good. We're kind of in an all or nothing sort of fork in the road, right? I think on the one hand, there is a lot more opening around these types of transformative ideas that we need to center issues of racial justice. We need to put more decision-making power in the hands of communities. Like, I'm hearing a lot more openness to those ideas, even among the old guard, right? You talked about the folks who say, well, it's always been a certain way. I think even those folks now understand that the scale of the crisis is so great that we're going to have to build something new. We can't just try to put the pieces back together. You see that even from Biden, right? Candidate Biden, Joe Biden sort of ran in the primary in some ways as a let's return to normalcy. But now as we're getting closer to the general election and as the pandemic has been going on, his rhetoric is starting to shift a little bit, right? It's a lot more, I think his latest slogan was build back better, or whatever it was, but like something that connotes, right, that we're trying to do. So I see that as a positive. Moderates are moving more into this. But the other thing I want to say here too is that you're also seeing more resistance that you talked about, Jim, that the backlash against building new, more inclusive, structural, transformative types of democracy, that backlash is also heightened, right? So you kind of see both sides, the people who have something to lose by giving up their position of control, they're fighting harder to keep their hand on the wheel. And you're starting to see a lot more bold demands coming from social movements who see the opening of this moment.
Do you get the feeling, though, that those that are clinging and clawing on to whatever power they have are losing the battle? Or are we not there yet?
We're not. I think we're not there yet. I mean, I think that the collective power of grassroots groups has radically shifted the window of possibility, right? We're having these big debates about, thanks to the Movement for Black Lives, we're having these big debates about police defunding and abolition, but also about community control. If you look at their demands, that is one of their central demands from the Movement for Black Lives, explicitly about more community control over decision-making at all levels. You're seeing a lot more conversation about structural democracy reform, right? Not just voting, but some of these deeper structures from the Electoral College to the Senate to a lot of these other types of issues, right? Statehood. So in that sense, I think we're winning the conversation, like the battle over ideas and possibilities. But whether these things become real is like, there's a long way to go between now and then. And I think sort of for folks who are getting on board, getting excited about these types of transformations, I would say we got to dig in and we got to sort of get ready for a long haul, because it's a sprint to November, but then there's going to be a long battle. Even if Trump is ousted from office in November, there's going to be a long battle about what policies then actually get done. And are we actually going to, put our money where our mouth is?
Yeah, it's a big rock to get over the hill. And I guess we're getting close to the top, but we're not there yet.
Yeah. So I'm optimistic. And I would say, like, now is a time for folks to double down and it's going to take all of us. So more people who are getting mobilized, getting engaged around these issues, I say that's great. Join us and stick with it for the long haul, because it's going to be a really intense next several years.
And I think that was the key too. Stick with it. Come on board, but you got to stay with us.
Totally.
Sabeel Rahman, an associate professor of law at Brooklyn Law School, president of Demos, co-author along with Hollie Russon Gilman of the book Civic Power, Rebuilding American Democracy in an Era of Crisis, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Sabeel, we appreciate your time very much. Would love to have you back again soon.
Thanks so much for having me, Jim, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, how Donald Trump hijacked populism and how progressives can reclaim its egalitarian roots. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
COVID-19 has been a doubly deadly disaster for millions of Americans, destroying both life and livelihoods. But one of the most heartening responses to the crisis has come from the least expected place, corporate executive suites. This spring, numerous CEOs made headlines by showing some class solidarity. If we're going to wallop our workers because of a pandemic, these bosses told media interviewers, the least we can do is cut our own salaries. Yes, all in this together. Only, not really. An analytical firm looked at the books of nearly all U.S. major corporations, finding that a mere fraction had made any cuts to senior executive pay, and the few that did only made little nicks in the boss's take-home rather than real cuts. The trick is that these sacrifices only applied to official salaries. They are the tiniest part of a chief executive's compensation, which mostly is made up of bonuses, stock options, etc. For example, United Airlines, which is presently zeroing out the paychecks of 36,000 workers, docked its CEO's salary by nearly a third. Sounds like a real gesture, but that works out to less than 3% of the $22 million he's getting in total pay. So middle-income workers get the boot, while the boss still has his job, gets more than $21 million in annual pay, and claims bragging rights for being an ethical corporate chieftain. The ethical crime here is not merely in the cynical fudging of numbers, but that even in this unprecedented time of national crisis, the elites who've converted capitalism into a system of plutocratic plunder still feel entitled to cheat. This is Jim Hightower saying, if a nation's economic system doesn't care about shared sacrifice in hard times, why should the majority who pay the price and are denied the gains care about that economic system?
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a Lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Rogers M. Smith's newest book is a deep dive into what populism could and should mean in the future of American politics. It offers a roadmap to how progressives can build a populist movement that better reflects its inclusive values. And we say hello to Rogers M. Smith, Christopher H. Brown Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, where he founded the Penn Program on Democracy, Citizenship, and Constitutionalism, now named the Andrea Mitchell Center of the Study of Democracy. And he is also the author of That Is Not Who We Are, Populism and Peoplehood. Roger Smith, thank you very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Great to be with you, Jim.
And nice to have you with us. This is a book about reclaiming populism. What or who are we reclaiming it from?
We're reclaiming populism from the kinds of authoritarian nationalist movements that now get called populist in Europe and in the United States, where Donald Trump is considered a populist. But populism really stems from the late 19th century American People's Party, and that was a progressive Democratic Party, very different from what gets called populism right now.
Well, and you advocate for a different kind of populism, one that is progressive and American at the same time. So give us the broad strokes of your thinking here.
A lot of people who consider themselves progressives have understandable concerns about embracing Americanism or a sense of national identity, which they fear can get tied up with xenophobia, chauvinism of many sorts. But we're at a moment in world history in which, with all the changes going on, nationalist appeals have great political resonance. And I think it's vital for now not to simply attack notions of national identity, but to try to promote forms of national identity, senses of American identity that are inclusive, egalitarian, and progressive.
And of course, the theme of identity politics runs through this book. Many, including some progressives, view identity politics as a fundamentally divisive phenomenon. But you argue it does not have to be. How can we rethink identity politics?
Well, the reality is that all politics are forms of identity politics, whether it's a class politics, whether it's a partisan politics, whether it's a national politics. All of them are expressing kinds of identities that people value and want to see represented in political life. It is, I think, pointless simply to attack the notion of identity politics, even though there are forms of identity politics that are certainly destructive. The challenge instead is to summon people to the better angels of their nature and form conceptions of our political identities that are more desirable and that contribute to more human benefit.
Something else I find interesting here, this book is also about storytelling and the kinds of stories progressive Democrats must begin to master. Why are stories so important in politics?
Well, you know, the historian Yuval Harari argues that, in fact, all kinds of human collective endeavors are made possible only by the fact that we share stories of who we are and what we're trying to do that inspires loyalty and cooperation in those endeavors. And it's certainly true of political communities that they've always been held together in part by a shared sense of who we are and what we're trying to achieve with each other and for each other. You can't really conduct politics without stories that bring us together.
We're speaking with Roger Smith, a Christopher H. Brown Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's also the author of That Is Not Who We Are, Populism and Peoplehood. Rogers, you're of the opinion that progressives have ceded the storytelling advantage to nationalists, the likes of Donald Trump. Why is that the case?
I think that for good reasons, many progressives associate nationalism with imperialist expansion, with repression of minorities, and that has all too often been the case. But when they don't advance, in our case, a sense of American identity that people can rally around and that makes them feel good about their political community, then the appeals of Donald Trump, who tells them that he's going to make America great again and offers a vision of that great America that appeals to constituencies that often feel embattled precisely because we have made the nation more inclusive and more egalitarian in some respects, though we still have far to go. His kind of story of America has proven to have an appeal that progressives don't counter effectively if they don't say, no, that's not who we are. Here's a much more positive vision of America.
Do you feel on some levels that perhaps the president right now is actually doing that himself? I mean, some of these statements that he's coming out and the way he's referring to the Black Lives Matter movement, to the coronavirus pandemic that we're undergoing, it seems to me that he's botching the story altogether.
Oh, absolutely. Over Independence Weekend, he gave speeches where he explicitly told his story of America, and he even tried to link it to the Declaration of Independence. But whereas the Declaration of Independence has most often been understood by figures like Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Martin Luther King as setting a mission for further progress for the country to overcome our imperfections and injustices and move toward a more perfect union, Trump interpreted the Declaration of Independence story as simply an occasion to celebrate America's past, as if it were unblemished and flawless. And his only suggestion for moving us forward is to create a garden of American heroes in which he celebrates everything in the past, overlooking the fact that unfortunately there's a lot in America's past and present that we need to improve.
And should not be proud of.
Should not be proud of, yes.
Yeah. And in describing the types of stories progressive politicians need to tell, you use the word peoplehood, and it's right there in the title of your book. What does that mean in the context of a story?
Well, a people is the collective identity that a story expresses and helps to create. And there are many different kinds of human communities. A more inclusive term for them, therefore, is a people rather than simply nation. American peoplehood can include many who are not currently formally American citizens, but they're part of the life of the American community, and so are, in that sense, part of the American people.
What makes you believe these kinds of stories will appeal to people?
I think it is necessary to tell stories that resonate with people where they are now, but appeal to their best senses of who they are. And in the book, I go through a variety of different kinds of progressive stories we can tell, appealing to America as a democracy, as a country in the quest of a more perfect union, as a country dedicated to the Declaration of Independence project of trying to extend full enjoyment of basic rights to all people of all colors everywhere, as Abraham Lincoln put it. And I think that these different stories will resonate with different parts of the American community, but overlap enough to build a broad coalition that I hope can move the country in a better direction than where we're headed now.
And we certainly could use that. The title of the book, That Is Not Who We Are, Populism and Peoplehood. The author who's joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast, Rogers M. Smith, Christopher H. Brown, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Rogers, we appreciate your time with us today. We'd love to have you back and talk about it again soon.
Thanks very much, Tim.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, why Trump's unprecedented relationship with Fox News is a threat to democracy. Bill Press talks with Brian Stelter, author of Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth.
Foxification of America and the Trumpification of Fox. Which is it? Or which came first?
It's got to be both. It's got to be both, Bill. You know, I think Fox has certainly changed television, changed our politics, and Trump has changed Fox. When Roger Ailes was forced out in 2016, the network was left with a leadership vacuum. As one person there said to me, we always produced Fox for an audience of one. That one viewer was Roger Ailes. And when he finally was exposed for his abuse of the staff, for his abuse of power, the network was still produced for an audience of one. It's just now the audience of one is Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, first of all, have we ever seen such a relationship between any news outlet and a president of the United States?
I really don't think we have. I describe this as state-supported TV. It's obviously not literally state-run. It doesn't need to be state-run. It's
Right.
more effective propaganda when it's not state-run. It is state-supported TV in dozens of different ways. And it has no historical parallel. I know there was a partisan press 100 years ago. I know lots of newspapers have opinion pages.
Yeah, right.
MSNBC, was thought of as the home team during the Obama years. But give me a break. Keith Olbermann, Rachel Maddow were never advising President Obama secretly. Obama wasn't glued to every hour of MSNBC or CNN. There's just nothing like this relationship.
I mean, there is nothing on the left which compares to the weight of and influence of Fox on the right, correct?
I think that is true, and I think that is part of the problem. It's part of what's broken. I just mentioned Rachel Maddow. When I watch her show, she talks about local news lovingly. She encourages people to subscribe to local newspapers. She shows their front pages.
Yeah.
Her 9 p.m. rival, Sean Hannity, says journalism is dead. And he lies all the time about the media and how evil the media is. He's telling you not to trust anything but Fox. He's telling you not to trust anything but Trump. On the other hand, you've got hosts on CNN and MSNBC and all around who are saying, go have a healthy diet, consume lots of different sources. If you don't trust me, check with someone else. Like, that's an openness versus Hannity's closed offness. And that's part of the problem. That's one of the reasons why the book is called Hoax. They say the word hoax so much. Trump's used the word hoax more than once per day so far in 2020. Hannity uses the word almost as often. They are telling their viewers and listeners and fans that you can't trust anything but them. And that's damaging.
Right. You make that point. I mean, this relationship, even for Fox viewers, right? I mean, it's not healthy for the for the Republic, not healthy for the democracy.
It doesn't benefit the people that it's intended to benefit. Fox viewers end up being misled because of this relationship. Like, for example, Hannity's talking with the president before his show. They're gabbing again after the show. It's like Hannity is producing Trump's presidency and Trump is producing Hannity's show. But viewers aren't even in on it. Viewers barely even have a sense of how it works. Mm-hmm. Hannity will talk about his sources, which is ironic because Trump always tells us not to trust anonymous sources. He claims that reporters make them up, which is not true. But Hannity will talk about his anonymous sources, and he's referring to the president being his tipster.
Right.
But there's very little transparency about the relationship. And I think that's one of the ways where this is a dishonest situation.
Right. So you've got this, millionaire, billionaire, whatever, real estate developer in New York, and you've got this nascent TV network. How did the relationship get started? You talk about that in the book.
It has a lot to do with Roger Ailes, who knew Trump as a kind of fellow New York blowhard type, in the 80s and 90s. Ailes is on the record saying they were friendly for decades. Trump has described Ailes similarly. I think it was one of these, you scratch my back, I scratch yours sorts of relationships, a transactional relationship. And it was really important in 2011 when Ailes put Trump on every week on Fox and Friends. This started in March of 2011 when Trump was on a birther streak with his racist lie about Obama. He was on there on Fox and Friends promoting that lie. And it became this weekly segment. And I think that was so important because it was like Trump got to learn what Fox cared about. Like Trump literally got to learn through the questions every week what Fox's priorities were, what the GOP's priorities were. And in some ways, I think it was the best political education Trump could have ever received.
Right. Well, you make a point which I found, I believe, but I hadn't thought about it, the importance of Fox and Friends in the political education of Donald Trump. And so we think about Sean Hannity, we think about Bill O'Reilly, we think about Tucker Carlson, but you point out that Fox and Friends really was more plugged into Donald Trump and him into Fox and Friends than any other show. And
I think that's fair. I think that's right. Certainly he was calling in every week until he came down the escalator. Then Roger Ailes said to him, I can't put you on anymore as a guest, because, I got to be fair to all the candidates. But of course, Trump started calling in even more often to Fox as a newsmaker, as a candidate. So the relationship never really faded away. If anything, it got stronger. I think one of the most disturbing quotes in the book is on page 43. I say, from a Fox producer, a former Fox and Friends producer, people think he's calling up Fox and Friends and telling us what to say. Hell no, it's the opposite. Yeah. We tell him what to say. We tell Trump what to say. And look, I know that guy's bragging, but there's a lot of truth to that.
Indeed. So Roger Ailes bragged about creating three presidents, Richard Nixon, I think Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. You almost have to give him credit for four, don't you?
Well, Trump is on the record saying in a recent documentary, I don't know if I'd be here in the Rose Garden of the White House were it not for Roger Ailes. Ailes had a funny line about this, though, because he sometimes thought that people exaggerated his power in the GOP. During the Obama years, when people would bring this up to him, he would say, if I was that powerful, we'd be winning, meaning, Romney would have won or McCain would have won. Right. Certainly, in the latter years, 2015, 2016, Ailes was not as sharp as he used to be. He was not as in power, as firmly in power as he used to be. He was starting to fade a little bit in terms of how much of a leader was at Fox. But his intimidation, his presence still loomed so large. And what a lot of sources at Fox said to me for this book was that they wish there was a strong leader there now. Some people even miss Ailes, even though he abused women, abused his power, because there's a real lack of leadership at Fox, and that's one of the real problems now.
Mm-hmm. By the way, you mentioned sources. I forget the exact number. What is it? 180 different? Fox?
Yeah. The way I say it in the book, I make a distinction between people who are currently at Fox, about 140 folks there who spoke to me at Fox. At all levels, these are production assistants all the way up to management, and then about 180 people that are in the Fox orbit. And what I mean by that are former staffers, agents, managers. There's a lot of people that know Fox really well, even though they aren't employees, and they helped fill in the blanks for me. And I think what was really important is, even though I had to rely heavily on anonymity and grant confidentiality to these staffers, there were current and former staffers who went on the record. Sean Graff is a researcher at Fox who went on the record while still working there saying Fox's allegiance to Trump is a threat, puts our democracy at risk. He did quit. He went to join the Michael Bloomberg campaign, which didn't work out very well. And he now works at a different network. But he spoke out when he still worked at Fox. And he it was accounts like his that backed up what I was hearing from anonymous sources that gave me the confidence for this book.
Right. So what role did Rupert Murdoch play in this emergence of Trump, if you will, as such an influence on Fox?
Yeah, there was this tension in 2015 and 2016 between Ailes and Murdoch when it came to Trump, because Rupert was not a big fan. Rupert was so critical of Trump on Twitter. Remember that day that Rupert tweeted out, "When will Donald stop embarrassing his friends and the entire country?" That's an incredible thing for Rupert Murdoch to say about Donald Trump. Ailes and Trump were close. Murdoch and Trump were not close. Murdoch always wanted more of a Paul Ryan Republican or a Jeb Bush kind of Republican. Rupert was not a fan. He propped up Ben Carson. He urged Michael Bloomberg to run in 2016. But I think he also understood why Trump was resonating. He understood what was happening in the GOP. And once Trump won the election, Murdoch moved quickly to improve that relationship, to get to know Trump better, to reach out, to strike a mutually beneficial partnership. I mean, they would never describe it that way, but that's what it is. And actually, Ailes got kind of bitter about that before Ailes passed away in May of 2017. Got kind of bitter at how cozy Rupert and Donald had become.
Mm-hmm. How do people there are some, let's say, alternative voices that we hear once in a while. Neil Cavuto, certainly Chris Wallace, occasionally Andrew Napolitano in the morning. There, for a long time, Shep Smith. How do they survive?
Well, you might think of them as exceptions to the rule. You might think of them as truth tellers inside this organization. I think the answer is different for each person, but let's take Shep Smith. He felt the squeeze. He felt like he was being suffocated a little bit inside Fox by all this pro-Trump propaganda. He used his 3 p.m. show to speak out against the primetime shows. He tried to correct the misleading narratives that were being spread on other hours. But eventually it just became too frustrating. His partner, persuaded him to leave. Other people in his inner circle saying you don't belong there anymore. Yeah. And eventually it came to be too much. I try to outline in the book, there are many reasons why he decided to leave. I think Chris Wallace has a little bit of an easier time because he has a program on Fox broadcast on Sunday mornings. So he's not as fully in the Fox News world, although his program does replay on Fox News and he is a guest on shows. He's able to have his own little, or not so little world there. Bret Baier, 6 p.m. anchor, he tells friends, he just keeps horse blinders on. He just focuses only on his show. He tries not to get emotional about Trump. He sees some of the chaos, but tries not to get emotional about it. And that's such an interesting word, Bill, because as human beings, what are we appealed to? What attracts us? Emotion, passion. That's what's worked ever since cavemen, right? That's what Hannity is fueled by is emotion. But Baier says, no, I want to be unemotional. And look, I think we see what wins, right? Hannity's ratings are twice as high as Bret Baier's ratings.
Right. I still consider myself, after several good years at CNN, as part of the CNN family. So I want to ask you about the influence of somebody else who put Donald Trump on television for 14 years as the host of The Apprentice, Jeff Zucker, now president of CNN. Does he get some of the blame or credit for elevating Donald Trump to the position he's in now?
To the extent that NBC presented Donald Trump as a successful billionaire businessman, I think there are a lot of folks at NBC who would say they get credit or blame. You can choose whatever word you want to choose for it. Yeah. What I appreciate about Zucker is that he has talked candidly about CNN's coverage of Trump. The Apprentice feels like a very long time ago to me. But right. CNN in 2015, 2016, we were showing many Trump rallies, unedited, so to speak, meaning live in their entirety. And I have to admit, I was one of those viewers that was absolutely captivated. I remember very vividly in the summer of 2015, on the couch with my wife, before we had kids or anything to worry about, and just being absolutely fascinated by this man on stage. And I think a lot of people can relate to that he, how new and shocking this was. But Zucker, to his credit, has said CNN ran too many of those rallies live without the right context or without cutting in, and has said that CNN won't in the future. And I think that's interesting because you don't oftentimes hear a network executive reflect on decisions like that. Certainly, I have not heard that from Fox. I will tell you. I do think it's notable how, yes, The Apprentice built up Trump as a businessman and that narrative of businessman. What Fox did was it as you said earlier, as we talked about it created his political identity and showed him what Fox viewers wanted. It showed him what the base wanted. So I would actually argue Fox and Friends was more influential in getting Trump to where he is today
than The Apprentice.
That's my view. I mean, different people have these arguments. I think they're very interesting, but I think Trump being front and center in the GOP base's imagination was largely thanks to Fox and birtherism.
Right. Early on the book, and as a theme you continue through the book, you make the point that we're not just talking about a politician and a network. We're talking about something that really transcends Donald Trump and transcends Fox in its impact on the Republic and on public policy. But certainly that came home to roost with the coronavirus pandemic, didn't it? In terms of how Fox and Trump both approached it.
Well, that's why this book is called Hoax. It was going to be called Wingmen because Trump has a lot of wingmen at Fox News. But in the end of February, Trump used the word hoax to say the Democrats were trying to politicize the virus. Really what was happening at the time was the Democrats were sounding the alarm really loudly and saying, President Trump, take this more seriously. And he didn't like that, called it a hoax. Of course, he never called the virus a hoax literally.
Right.
But by using the word in connection to this issue, by talking about it as politics instead of a health emergency, I think he did damage. I think he gave permission to his fans not to take it so seriously, right? And that's what he does with the word hoax all the time. As soon as he attaches the word hoax to something, you're told it doesn't matter. The Russia hoax is what he says most often. Russia, anything involving Trump and Russia, just believe it's a hoax. It's quite a savvy, cynical, rhetorical strategy just to say hoax and just dismiss it. And so, he brought it up in the context of the virus once. Hannity did the same thing in early March. And I think we can see, based on the track record of public statements, that there was an attempt to downplay this disease until it was undeniable anymore, right? Thousands of people in this country were sick. And Trump kept saying, I closed the door. I banned the travel from China, which we know he didn't do, but he did put in some restrictions. It's like he was bragging about closing the back door when he left the front door wide open. And that's what Hannity did as well. He bragged about the back door and left all the side doors open, left the front door and the side doors wide open, kept all the windows open. And I think what's important about hoax, and the reason why I'm glad that I was able to write this, is I was able to reconstruct that timeline and show the impact. Because I got to be honest, Bill, I think it's worse than people even realize. In terms of what was being said in early March, before the shutdowns went into effect, it's like they all did a U-turn so suddenly. I think people had whiplash as a result.
Right. And as we speak today, over 6 million cases in the United States, right, and over 183,000 dead. And I just saw today 900 Americans dying of COVID-19 every day.
And that's supposedly an improvement, right? We were up over 1,000 dead a day last week. These numbers have come down somewhat, but what I always think about, Bill, is that every single one of these numbers is a person and a family and a story and a community and a home that has been wrecked by this disease. And it's almost too much to bear. It's almost too big for the media to get our arms around. It's almost too big a story to tell. And you know what's happened to Fox? They've mostly moved on, right? They start every hour with not every hour. Fox and Friends almost every day starts with violence in the cities instead of COVID. And I'll be watching CNN's New Day and the lead is COVID. And then I turn to Fox and Friends and it's like COVID hasn't permeated. It's like COVID's faded away.
Yeah.
And I know that they can wish for that, but no amount of wishful thinking is going to get rid of the virus.
Bill Press with Brian Stelter, author of Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Sabeel Rahman, Rogers M. Smith, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.